Afternoon, everybody. This is Southport Armchair History Virtual Tours, and it's brought to you today by the Southport Historical Society in collaboration with Harper Library and the Friends of the Library, Southport and Oak Island. And today we have Debbie Mollycheck, and she will be presenting a presentation on life in the Garrison. Debbie's grandparents lived in the Garrison, her and their family lived there for 14 years, and so she's going to tell us what life was like for them back in the 1930s and 1940s. So Debbie, anytime you're ready to start.
This is Debbie Mollycheck. My husband Larry Mitlin and I are coming to you from our home in Fort Mill, South Carolina. We're about a 5-minute drive from Charlotte, North Carolina. I would ask if you have any questions or comments to please wait until the end. There are a lot of interesting stories to be told. One question I am hoping to have time to answer at the end is, are there really ghosts at the Garrison? I consulted with a medical doctor who has the answer for us. To understand how and why the Mollycheck family lived at the Garrison from 1937 to 1951, we need to briefly talk about navigational aids. From the creation of the Federal Lighthouse Service in 1789 until the service was consolidated with the Coast Guard in 1939, the Lighthouse Service had only one duty. What was that? The main duty was maintenance and operation of aids to navigation along the coast and river channels to make those waterways safe for mariners. The Lighthouse Service was also one of the first federal bureaus mandated to protect life and property. When we think of navigational aids, we usually picture the beautiful tall lighthouses, like the Bald Head Lighthouse over the river in this picture. But lighthouses were just a fraction of the aids to ships. There was also the Frying Pan Lightship, ranges, buoys, and day beacons. In 1913, in the lower Cape Fear River, a third and final new system of lights was established during the lighthouse years. In this new system, the Lighthouse Service transferred the Bald Head Lighthouse to the riverkeepers. The first riverkeeper of the new system was in charge not only of the Bald Head Lighthouse, but 18 lights in the river from the mouth near Bald Head up towards Wilmington, about 20 miles. The first keeper, whose official title was laborer in charge, served in his position for 35 years. His name was Henry Berry. He was an African-American born before the Civil War. He would be the first and only African-American to serve in the position. I have been writing the wonderful story of Mr. Berry. His story is buried deep in the National Archives. It took me 7 years to research and write. May and Jimmy Moore used to tell me that I thought all the stories I tell about Southport are wonderful. But that's true, they are. By 1913, Sonny Dozier had served as the keeper of the Bald Head Lighthouse for 31 years. He passed his key to the lighthouse to Henry Berry. Each riverkeeper would pass the key to his successor. When Keeper Mollycheck arrived in the Cape Fear in 1937, he would be the final civilian riverkeeper to be in charge of the key to the Bald Head Lighthouse. How would Keeper Mollycheck make his way to the Cape Fear River? Franto Mollycheck II was born on the family farm in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina in 1902. Mount Pleasant is separated from Charleston by the Cooper River. Franto plowed and planted the 10-acre farm with his mother and father in Mount Pleasant until he was 20 years old. But on September 16, 1923, Franto said, "Good riddance to farm life." He walked the 3 miles to the water's edge where he had seen the lighthouse tender working. He hopped the ferry to Charleston. He had been told by a sailor aboard the tender Palmetto that if he wanted a job with the lighthouse service, he needed to go talk to the boss, Superintendent Henry Beck, at the old Exchange building downtown. And that is what my grandfather did. He walked to the old Exchange in downtown Charleston. That would be the bottom right-hand picture. Superintendent Beck was in charge of all the navigational aids, tenders, lightships, and employees from New River, North Carolina, down past Southport to Jupiter Inlet, Florida. On September 16, 1923, after he was hired, Superintendent Beck showed Seaman Mollycheck around the Lighthouse Depot. The depot was about a mile walk from the old Exchange in the Ashley River, and that's the 3 pictures up top. Mollycheck would spend half his time working the waters and the other half at the depot, loading supplies and cleaning the buoys. When we're able to go exploring again, the old Exchange is an interesting museum open to the public. The Lighthouse Depot today is occupied by the Coast Guard. On the top picture of the depot station, you can see the little lighthouse on the post. Above the Coast Guard name on the building, you see a lighthouse. The Lighthouse Service, under the direction of Superintendent Beck, built this depot in 1916. Beck was in charge of the depot from 1916 until 1939 when the Coast Guard took over, and you can also visit this today. My grandfather served aboard his first boat, the 90-foot tender Palmetto. He helped to repair the navigational aids in the lower and upper Cape Fear River and other rivers and coastlines. He worked his way up to being promoted to the larger 155-foot tender Mangrove as quartermaster. The Mangrove worked the larger buoys and supplied the lightships. She brought supplies for the keepers at the Cape Fear and Bald Head lighthouses and the Frying Pan lightship. Why did Quartermaster Mollycheck decide to apply for a light keeper's position? There were 3 reasons. First, he had married my grandmother Lilla in Charleston in June 1926. She was 17 years old, he was 23. Although they had been dating for a year, she promised her Baptist preacher father that she would not marry until she finished high school. A month after graduation, they married. Lilla always called her husband Doc. If he wasn't out to sea or in the yard, she could find him on the docks. She could not be with him on the many days he was out to sea on the tenders. The second reason he applied to be a keeper was Doc's income while on the tenders ranged from $7,000 to $13,000 in today's money. He needed more income for the family. Finally, they were pregnant with their first child. Lilla wanted the family to be together. Doc took and passed the lighthouse keeper civil service exam. He met the other qualifications. He could read and write and was an expert boatman. Aboard the tenders, he had worked most of the navigational aids and bodies of water from Florida to Southport. On June 23, 1927, Superintendent Beck came aboard the Mangrove and gave Doc the good news. He would be leaving the same day as an additional keeper at his first lighthouse. Their daughter, Mary Ann, was born 2 months later. As long as the lighthouse stations had housing, Lilla and Keeper Mollycheck would now be together as a family. And that is how Doc would eventually be promoted to keeper of the Cape Fear River Lights. In 2018, the Southport Historical Society asked me if I would be interested in submitting a proposal for a possible exhibit of the Mollycheck's life at the Garrison. I submitted a manuscript proposal. At the end of the manuscript, I thanked 55 gracious people of Southport, family members, old and new friends that shared memories of my family and stories of theirs. I appreciate all of you, and especially your kindness in tolerating my sometimes overflowing enthusiasm. Let's go inside the Mollycheck home. At 10 a.m., January 7th, 1937, Franto Mollycheck arrived at the Garrison with his family. He was transferred and promoted to keeper of the Lower Cape Fear River system. He would be in charge of his station at the Garrison for the next 14 years. By this time, my grandmother, Lilla, was 27 years old. Their daughter, Mary Ann, was 9, and my father, Franto III, was 8. Lilla was 6 months pregnant. Their son, Ralph, would be born in Southport in April 1937. Doc would serve as the last civilian keeper of the Lower Cape Fear River Lights until his retirement in July 1951. His would be the only lighthouse family to occupy the Garrison as a home. Look at Keeper Mollycheck's desk. The book on the left, titled Instructions to Employees of the U.S. Lighthouse Service, controlled daily life at the Garrison. It is the same book that guided his good friend, Keeper Luddy Munn, who served across the river at the Cape Fear Lighthouse on Bald Head Island. In addition to his river duties, Keeper Mollycheck had to keep his Garrison reservation in A+ order as defined in the book. Under the inkwell, you will see what was the log that Keeper Mollycheck had to keep on a daily basis. The duties of the keeper had grown since 1913. With the opening of the Intracoastal Waterway, the keeper's responsibilities would continue to increase. He and his assistant, light attendant James Smith, were now in charge of 55 lights and additional day marks. Doc's lights would increase further in the 1940s. The keeper and his Coast Guard assistant in the 1940s, Glennie Howard, would also be assigned the navigational aids running down to the South Carolina line. Because the keeper was required to place his desk where Superintendent Beck could easily access it on any surprise inspection, it was kept downstairs at the Garrison. The log page was always turned to the current day. If you look to the right, you see Doc's Lighthouse Service Bulletin. Superintendent Beck forwarded the bulletin to his employees once a month. The bulletin contained a variety of information. There were short reports of keepers who had saved lives and property. Reports were shared about men who had been prosecuted for stealing government property or fired for consuming alcohol, or who were promoted. There were detailed articles about the advancement of lighthouse technology. And one time there was a lengthy article about flies spreading the infection by vomiting the feces they ate. It was a wide variety of information provided to the keepers. On the west wing of the Garrison, the Lighthouse Service had for years stored supplies for the light stations. Keeper Mollycheck was responsible for keeping an inventory of those supplies and distributing supplies to Keeper Munn at the Cape Fear Light Station on Bald Head Island. The Cape Fear Light was first lit by Keeper Charles Swan on Bald Head on August 31, 1903. It was about 4 miles away from the Bald Head Light. Keeper Munn joined the Lighthouse Service in 1917. One of his first stations was as an assistant to Keeper Charles Swan. He was soon promoted to Georgia, but he would return and serve as the head keeper from 1935 through 1943. Keeper Munn and his wife Susie would become good friends of the Mollychecks. Life was not all work at the Garrison. If you look at the top of the secretary, to the left of the little lighthouse is Lila's scrapbook about her days in Southport. My grandmother's scrapbook is what brought me back to Southport in 2012. I had been gone from here for about 20 years. When I opened her book, I was hooked. I wanted to know more. So we're going to take a look inside her scrapbook in a moment, but I want to talk to you about a few other things. The secretary that the scrapbook is sitting on belonged to my great-grandmother, Lila's mother. It traveled with the family from station to station. Grandma said sometimes they had only a moment's notice to pack. The mangrove would come around the bend, sounding her signal, and the family would run quickly, pack, and take their belongings to the dock to move on to their next station. The chair in front of the desk, you can see just a little bit of the top of it, is from Grandma's dining room set and buffet she bought in Wilmington in the 1940s. Doc's income in today's dollars ranged from $25,000 to $35,000 while at the Garrison. Grandma had endeavors going on that allowed her to make a few extra dollars, and she bought her dining room set on time. On the bookshelf, starting at the bottom, you can see some books. Books were important to the family. Grandma used to say that after chores at the isolated station, there wasn't much left to do but fish and read. When they were at the isolated stations in Georgia and Florida, the tender mangrove would deliver a portable library to the family. When the family moved into the Garrison, there was a public library in the East Wing. The library was first opened in 1912. It was now a bonus to be living in a home with its library. The door at the end of the Garrison that says Southport Public Library no longer exists. Also on the exhibit bookshelves are boxing gloves that were a prized possession of my father. Boxing for Southport boys took hold in 1941. A local boy, Johnny Simmons, had participated in the Star News Golden Gloves tournament. He ended up going to World War II, but before the war, he organized local boys for benefit boxing shows. Big crowds showed up at the high school for the events. Judges and referees for the games included Captain Bustles, James Harper, and Robert Thompson. With the war on the horizon, Johnny Simmons organized his young boxers to go to the Garrison and other Southport homes to collect old aluminum pots and pans for national defense use. The Bible on the top of the bookshelf with the crochet gloves draped over the Bible was a gift to Lila from the Southport Baptist Church in 1946. All the crochet work in the exhibit is the handiwork of my grandmother. Lila was head of the church's primary department. She taught Bible school during the summer, assisted by Mrs. Ivan Ludlum. When Grandma drove the church bus to pick up the children, she kept old shoes up front for the children to wear if they boarded with bare feet. The picture above the bookshelf is Lila's mother. When I grew up next to my grandmother on the family farm in the 60s and 70s, the same farm where Doc was born, her Southport Bible was always next to her chair. When she could no longer drive across the Cooper River Bridge to church, she watched preachers on TV and wrote extensively in the Bible. After Grandma died in 1998, her Bible went missing. Through numerous letters, which I started writing in 2012, I located the Bible in Illinois and got it back home. Church and family time on Sundays were important to Lila and Doc. Unless Keeper Mollycheck had an emergency, he did not work the lights on Sundays. Who was the first person to introduce himself to Lila and Doc as they moved into the Garrison on the morning of January 7th? In all likelihood, it was Bill Kasaya. Kasaya had important news. He was founder and president of the Southport Civic Club, and most of the time its only member. He was also a reporter for the State Port Pilot. Kasaya could not hear or read lips. About 1890, as an energetic 5-year-old, Kasaya heard his last words ever. He had been stricken with tuberculosis of the bone. On January 7, 1937, as Kasaya approached Keeper Mollycheck, he handed him his white, pocket-sized notebook he wrote in to communicate. Kasaya explained what the keeper needed to know. The USS Perch, SS-176, would be visiting Southport on January 14th. The submarine would be making Southport her first port of call on her shakedown cruise. In a short time, Kasaya would teach the whole Mollycheck family his sign language. The Perch submarine would be moored at the keeper's government dock for 2 days. Hundreds of visitors would line up on the Garrison lawn to inspect the submarine. Kasaya just wanted the keeper to know. You can see in the picture the keeper's small 30-foot lighthouse boat, number 82, on the inside of the T on the middle dock. The Perch would be moored to the other side soon. Off in the distance to the left is the quarantine station. The quarantine station would become Lilla's favorite fishing spot. The Perch provided free advertising to Southport for several months in 1936 and 1937, but the Perch eventually had to assume its real purpose of fighting in a war. The 59 men on the Perch became the first Navy prisoners of war from the Pacific Submarine Fleet to be captured on March 3, 1942. Some of those prisoners had stepped inside the Garrison in 1937 to visit the public library. I wrote a very interesting article on the Perch. A copy of the story is at the Southport Historical Society and the Maritime Museum. Back to Lilla's scrapbook. What did she keep inside from Southport? Lilla had clipped many articles and pictures and pasted them in the book. The problem was that she had cut off the newspaper date lines on many of them. She knew the sources and dates, but I sure did not. She did not label most of the pictures inside. To put the dates to the clippings and to hopefully discover more about the family's life at the Garrison, my husband Larry and I copied every State Port Pilot from 1935 to 1957. When we started doing this, none of the papers were online. I read and analyzed all the State Port Pilots to find these lost stories. Beginning in 2012, I wrote many letters seeking help with my efforts to gather more information about the family. I can still remember jumping with excitement when my paralegal told me a man was calling from Southport in response to my 2012 letter. That first person I heard from was Jimmy Harper. Jimmy and my Uncle Ralph used to throw a baseball back and forth in the dirt street between Jimmy's house and the Garrison. Jimmy said when the baseball wore out, they couldn't afford another. They went to Keeper Mollycheck's Lighthouse supply room to rewrap the ball, then they were back at it. The second person to call was Jack Swan. Jack said my father, Franto III, was his best friend. We talked at length about their many adventures. What I remember the most were the positive attributes Jack told me about my dad. The conversation was all the more special because my dad died of a heart attack when I was in my last year of law school. He was 53 years old. The lengthy explanation on the picture of Jack is for my dad's good friend. Another early contact was Joy Arnold Gregory. Joy gave me unique insight into Lilla. She gave me letters my grandmother had written to Joy's mother, Bertha Arnold. The letters were over 35 years old. In this picture, 2-year-old Ralph Mollycheck is watching as his parents, Lilla and Doc, pull away to fish with Ann and Charles Farrell. It was the first time Ralph was left out of a fishing trip by his mother since his birth. He was not happy. From my research, I have been able to glue Grandma's stories back together. This is the first newspaper story in Lilla's scrapbook. The original photograph was given to Lilla by Charles Farrell in 1938. In 1937, Charles Farrell had been hired to take photographs for a very special, unique for its time, children's book. The book is entitled Toby. A current-day historian rediscovered the book and in 2019 published his own book about Toby. Toby was so successful, Farrell decided to write a book on fishing, which he began researching in 1938 with the help of Bill Kasaya in Southport. While Farrell took hundreds of fishing pictures in Southports from 1938 until the war, he never did write his fish book. I wrote Mr. Farrell's son, Dr. Roger Farrell, seeking to find movie pictures his dad had taken in Southport, Baldhead Island, and Orton Plantation. Dr. Farrell had not been able to locate the movies. He did tell me that his dad never wrote the fish book. Dr. Farrell stated his dad had a mental breakdown following the war that ended his career. He also told me that his dad learned sign language so that he could communicate with Mr. Kasaya. And Kasaya, according to Dr. Farrell, knew all the fishermen and made contacts that allowed Farrell to go out on the fishing boats. So while Farrell never got to write his fish book, the beautiful pictures he took in October 1938, with the help of the Malachis and Mr. Kasaya, can be found in May and Jimmy Moore's book, Back in the Day, and throughout Southport today. But in October 1938, Mr. Farrell had high hopes. To take the pictures for his first fish book, Farrell asked Kasaya to introduce him to the fishermen on Baldhead Island and in Southport. In October 1938, Kasaya arranged for Keeper Mollycheck and Lilla to take Farrell and others to Baldhead for a day of picture taking. After arriving on Baldhead, Lilla spent the day fishing. Kasaya accompanied Farrell to the fishermen of the Varnum Shore Fishery on the island. Keeper Mollycheck was working at the Baldhead Lighthouse. The man in the suit and hat to the left in the picture is Frank Sherrill, who had purchased Baldhead Island a few months before the photographs. Despite the bad press Frank Sherrill received in later years, he was very helpful to Kasaya and several major promotional endeavors that significantly benefited Southport before the war. After all the photographs were taken, Sherrill invited everyone in the picture and Farrell and Kasaya to dinner at his home. Next to Mr. Sherrill, facing the camera, is Susie Munn. Mrs. Munn was the wife of Cape Fear lightkeeper Luddy Munn. She was one of Lilla's closest fishing buddies. Lilla is facing away from the camera with her 27-pound red drum. The state port pilot reported that Susie and Lilla, wives of lightkeepers, had established a reputation for being about the best local fisherwomen. Next to Lilla is Coast Guardsman Adrian Willits, and next to him, Mrs. Marshall. Mrs. Marshall was the wife of Reverend Arthur Marshall. Reverend Marshall was rector of the St. Philip's Episcopal Church of Southport. Marshall made news for preaching to congregations along the coast in his 40-foot church boat, the Josephine Marshall. Marshall's boat was moored next to Keeper Mollycheck's boat at the Garrison. When the keeper's boat was out of service, he used the Josephine to tend the lights. Marshall would occasionally assist Keeper Mollycheck with the navigational aids. Sometimes Keeper Mollycheck and Lilla would accompany the Marshalls on their water preaching. When they did, Doc would always be at the wheel of the Josephine. On this picture in her scrapbook, Lilla did write some names. To the far right is Reverend Marshall. Lilla also wrote in her scrapbook, taking boat upriver for Minister Marshall to preach to riverbank folk. This cartoon of Reverend Marshall's preaching on the waterfront, went nationwide in 1939. The cartoon is by John Hicks. Hicks wrote Strange as It Seems, a syndicated cartoon feature published from 1928 to 1970. Keziah provided Hicks this story. Was Lilla's 27-pound drum that she caught on Bald Head Island a fluke or a skill? There are many a fish story in my grandmother's scrapbook. Lilla honed her fishing skills at the foot of the various isolated stations before coming to Southport. She fished to pass the time and to feed her family. After being in Southport a couple of years, a third reason would emerge. Lilla was competitive. She got in on the beginning of Keziah's plan to draw fishermen to Southport for the sport and eventually prizes. In July 1939, Lilla entered the Charlotte Observer Fishing Contest. Her 6-pound bigmouth bass was clocked in by Keziah at the Civic Club weighing station. Keziah reported she took her fish on a medium-sized hickory rod with a Belmont reel. She used the same tackle for both salt and freshwater fishing. Lilla's local prize was a picture of the Garrison by Keziah. Keziah reported, without using a byline, that the picture was taken by moonlight and is credited with being about the most unusual and attractive picture that has ever been made of the Garrison. The sailors on the Frying Pan lightship had read about Lilla's fishing adventures. The Frying Pan was anchored in the Gulf Stream, 35 miles out from the Cape Fear Lighthouse. When local Southport captains would take fishing parties out to the Gulf Stream, beginning about 1937, the captains would drop off to the lightship newspapers and magazines from Keziah. The sailors would give the captains their mail to take back to Southport, and they would also report on whether the fish were biting or not. After reading about Lilla's valuable prizes from various fishing clubs for her catches in 1939, crew members of the Frying Pan lightship presented her with a costly reel and a big assortment of tackle. Lilla was thrilled. But Lilla did not spend all her time fishing. She had 3 children to raise. If Keeper Mollycheck had to be in the river at 4 a.m. for his 2 days up the Intracoastal Waterway, Lilla was up an hour before making breakfast. She packed enough meals for 2 days. This picture was a publicity shot taken by the newly opened North Carolina State Advertising Division, of course with the help of Keziah. But what I want you to look at is what is hanging at the top and bottom porches. Lilla washed clothes by hand every day and ironed, not only the shirts and handkerchiefs, but the sheets. She would say, they were poor but cleaned and pressed. Lilla's wet clothes are hanging outside on the Garrison porches in this picture. She had learned early at those hot isolated stations in Georgia and Florida that the sea breeze blowing against the wet clothes cooled the house. With war approaching, Lilla would soon be hanging blankets at the windows to block out the lights. Late war bulletins began appearing weekly in the Stateport Pilot in October 1939. By September 16, 1940, Congress had enacted the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. In October 1941, the Mollycheck family could observe from the Garrison front porch the building progressing on the new USO Recreation Center on the corner. The gymnasium and large porch facing the river would soon serve as a recreation center for Army and Navy men stationed in the area. James Harper's big headline in the paper December 10, 1941 ran across the page, U.S. declares war on Japan Monday. When the USO opened in January 1941, Lilla and Marianne Mollycheck signed up as volunteers. Marianne would meet her future husband there. Teenagers would hang out many a day at the recreation center. A copy of the roll of 75 Southport volunteers was presented to Mayor John Erickson by the USO as a permanent record. Lilla and the other volunteers were proud to receive a letter from the USO thanking them for their service. Patriotic Southport people heeded the government's request to eat less of those foods needed by our men overseas. With fish from the Cape Fear River, crabs at the government dock in front of the garrison, and chickens in their backyard, the Mollycheck family complied with the request. Keeper Mollycheck contributed to the war effort by planting a victory garden in the garrison's backyard. Lilla and Doc had learned to supplement store-bought food during their lean years in the Lighthouse service. The State Port pilot reported in 1943 that Keeper Mollycheck's victory garden was about the best in town. Lilla had a homemade cookbook that is displayed in the Garrison exhibit. She and her friends exchanged cost-cutting recipes. When brown sugar was available, Lilla made a special treat called brown dogs. The peanut recipe was given to Lilla by Lou and Brooke Newton's mom. What happened to high school graduation during the war? This is a picture of the Southport 6th grade class taken about 1939. There are 29 students. The picture is hanging in our Garrison exhibit. Mary Ann is sitting on the left on the next to the bottom step with her one white shoe sticking out. The picture was given to me by Mary Ann's classmate, Bobby Jones. The students were identified by another classmate, Hoyle Dozier. These students would graduate in 1944 when there were 11 grades. At their abbreviated high school graduation on May 14, 1944, only 19 of the 29 students graduated. Some of the usual ceremonial activities were suspended. What did not survive during the war was organized school sports. There were no sports between most of the schools. Teachers were going to war. There was no money to travel. Instead, pickup games were played. Here is Franto Mollycheck's friend, Billy Wells, in one of the pickup games at the Garrison during the war. When Billy turned 16 years, he would become one of the youngest captains on a big trawler. Local boys, including Skippy Stiller and Franto, played softball at the Garrison and other places in town beginning the summer of 1942. The boys would soon be playing softball against the Coast Guard men. One of the very good softball pitchers for the Coast Guard was Winston Booker. Booker served with the Mounted Patrol. Before Editor Harper left for war, he put his wife Margaret in charge of the State Port Pilot's management. The hope was she could make enough money to keep it alive. Bill Casaya would carry on with the reporting. When publisher James Harper was about to board his ship, he told Margaret, "If the bank account goes below $500, shut the paper down." With no fishing and no tourism, Casaya devised a plan to bring attention to Southport. That plan in 1943 was to round up some pretty Southport girls and take them over to Bald Head for a photo shoot with the boys of the Mounted Patrol. In the notebook Casaya carried, he kept the names of Southport girls he deemed suitable to serve as models for photo shoots. My Aunt Mary Ann made Casaya's notebook. After getting his 3 models, Casaya arranged for a North Carolina state government reporter and a photographer to join the party. Here was the problem. Any photographs taken had to be handed over to the military. No pictures could be sent to newspapers or magazines without government authority. That glitch did not stop Casaya. I want to show a few of the pictures that were taken on Bald Head Island in 1943, and even today, these pictures resurface in publications. Once clearance was obtained from the captain of the Port of Wilmington, the models Casaya and the rest of the party were provided passage to the Bald Head Lighthouse by Chester Hennis, boatswain's mate in the Coast Guard. Chester Hennis is in uniform in the center on the dock with his hands on his hips. I began communicating with his daughter Patty in 2014. Patty would eventually donate her dad's treasured uniform to the Southport Maritime Museum. If you can hear the dog, like some people on CNN, somebody's coming to the door, and our dog Homer is not happy. When we started this, he was asleep. Once the party landed at the boardwalk, the photographer wanted a special shot. The daring mounted patrol man ran up the Bald Head Tower steps and put his feet to the edge. He is signaling to Mary Ann and Marion Fradair and Marion Frank to pose for a picture. In this picture, we see Marion Frank and the daring sailor. Marion was the daughter of Southport attorney Bud Frank. She was in college when this was taken and would graduate from Chapel Hill in 1944 with honors. She was the first woman pilot from Brunswick County to obtain a license. But in this picture, she was hanging on tight. It was the first time she had ever been on a horse. I was never able to determine the name of the daring sailor. The girl with her mouth open is my Aunt Mary Ann. The mounted patrol hunk on her left is softball pitcher Winston Booker. He knew the Mollycheck family well from all the softball he played at the Garrison. On the horse is Winston Booker and Marion Frank. In the rear, the daring sailor. I spoke with Booker's son in 2014. He told me his father's horse was named Blackfoot. He said his dad did not talk about the war days much, but was proud to have served. The picture of Mary Ann and Booker appeared on the back cover of a magazine a year or two later. I've never been able to locate a copy. If you look at this picture closely, you can see the three girls on the mounted patrol horses. On the left is the Cape Fear Lighthouse. The last civilian keeper, Luddy Munn, was at the station when the photograph was taken. When Munn was transferred on December 1, 1943, the lighthouse was manned exclusively by Coast Guardsmen. Mary Ann is walking down the road towards the lighthouse in the picture. On the right picture, Mary Ann is standing with her scarf on. Next to her sitting is Winston Booker. Marion Frank is in the middle. To the left is Marion Fradair. She was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Valley Fradair of Southport. Marion later joined the Cadet Nurses Corps. The first paper to carry three of the pictures was the Sunday News of New York that ran half a page. In 1944, the Sunday News had a circulation of 3.7 million readers. The pictures would continue to run in newspapers and magazines for several years. Wide World Photos distributed the photographs to newspapers and magazines all over the world beginning in May 1944. The pictures brought great publicity to Brunswick County. Thanks to the work of Margaret Harper, Keziah, and partly through the publicity from the photographs, the State Port Pilot's bank account never went below $500. The paper continued to publish throughout the war. Publisher James Harper made it home from the war. He lost one of his brothers, Captain Durwood Harper, a bomber pilot killed in action July 26, 1944. Today, May 8th, is a 75th anniversary celebration. May 8th is Victory in Europe Day, known as VE Day. This day celebrates the formal acceptance by the Allies of Nazi Germany's surrender in World War II, marking the end of World War II. Before talking about the happier days in Southport after the war, I want to give a special thank you to Morgan Harper, current editor of the State Port Pilot. Morgan, I greatly appreciate that your family kept the newspaper going during the war. Without the State Port Pilot, I would not be telling these stories today. There would be no Mollycheck exhibit at the Garrison. I continue to look forward to receiving the State Port Pilot each week here in Fort Mill, South Carolina. I can see the special efforts you and your staff are making during the losses and challenges caused by today's virus. Future historians will be grateful to have today's stories being published in the State Port Pilot. After the death and sacrifices of the war years, Southport returned to its new normal. Bigger and better sports fishing took hold in Southport. Lila and her son Ralph, now 9 years old, both participated in the Southeastern North Carolina Beach Association annual fall fishing rodeo. The first rodeo was held in 1946. There were 2,000 entries. Lila won the biggest fish caught by a woman, which came with money and a trophy. Ralph won several prizes also. They both caught their winning black drums at the quarantine station. Until Keeper Mollycheck retired, Lila and Ralph would participate in the rodeos. Lila's scrapbook is full of prize-winning certificates from a variety of fishing contests over the years. The annual basketball championship games between Brunswick County's high schools had been a casualty of the war. The tournaments had been called off in 1942 and would not return for 3 years. The graduating class of 1947, which included my father, got one break. In 1942, school grades in North Carolina were increased from 11 to 12. The first class to complete 12 grades was the class of 1947. There was no graduating class in 1946. The county did not have enough money to etch the starters' names onto the trophy. The team had to raise the money to get it engraved. Because it only had a limited amount of space, the entire team agreed that the 5 starters' names should go on the trophy. Those 5 were Skippy Stiller, Al Shannon, Lou Newton, Jimmy Russ, and my dad. My dad is kneeling down in the bottom right-hand corner. Jimmy Russ, one of the starters, told this story to the State Port Pilot in 2015. He said it was quite an important victory in 1947. Women were granted the right to serve on juries in North Carolina after the war in 1947. When Lila was 38 years old, she became the first woman drawn for jury duty in Brunswick County. Men could ask their wives not to serve, or they could ask the court that their wives not serve. Doc did not make that request, nor would Lila have let him. When the soldiers came home from war, there were weddings. Mary Ann married Tom Worry at the Southport Baptist Church. Her maid of honor was Eleanor Reese. Ushers were Billy Wells, Lou Newton, and my dad. Tom had been stationed on a crash boat for 2 years. This picture was taken outside the Garrison. Tom and Mary Ann would be married for 58 years. And this is the family wedding picture in 1946 at the Garrison. The wedding reception was held at the Garrison. Guests were served by Susie Carson, Margaret Harper, and Mrs. Sam Reese. A great time was had by all. The Southport Historical Society has prepared a video of the Mollycheck family during their years in Southport that is in the Garrison exhibit. The video will be posted on Facebook, and I hope that you'll watch it. There's more information that we didn't have time to tell today. For instance, the video tells the terrible story of what happened to Keeper Mollycheck on the river shortly after he arrived. Tending those heavy acetylene gas tanks could be very dangerous. So what about the ghosts? I consulted with a medical doctor to provide a final diagnosis on the question, are there ghosts in the Garrison? There have been rumors for years that indeed there are ghosts in the Garrison. Some say strange sounds come from upstairs. In the 1800s, 3 young sisters died on the Fort Johnston grounds. Some accounts say they were murdered. Another says they died within days of one another from illness. Their father committed suicide after his girls died, or did he? The 3 girls, 3, 5, and 10, are buried side by side in the old Smithville burying ground. Look at the Garrison floor plan from when my family was there. My father's bedroom was upstairs in the Garrison. His room was on the right. His family called him Sonny. One night he saw a man holding the hand of a young girl walk through his bedroom. Although it happened when my dad was a teenager, he said the hair on his head still stood up when telling us the story as an adult. When Grandma, Doc, Mary Ann, Ralph, and Sonny would be eating supper at night, they would sometimes hear what would sound like footsteps upstairs. The dining room downstairs to the right looks like it was located where the Mollycheck exhibit is today. When I began my research in 2012, I wanted to put an end to the ghost rumors. So in 2012, I called my uncle, Dr. Ralph Mollycheck in Florida. He was 75 years old. Ralph graduated from the Medical University of South Carolina. He served 8 years as a doctor in the Navy. When he was in private practice in Charleston, he helped to establish the psychiatric unit at the Medical University Hospital. So I asked Ralph, do you think maybe there might be a possibility that Garrison is haunted? After some strong Navy talk, Dr. Mollycheck concluded, ain't no maybe about it, that place is haunted. Then he proceeded to tell me a ghost story. Ralph died the next year and is buried at South Florida National Cemetery. My dad always considered Southport to be his hometown. He would come back to the river and fish with his good friend Lou Newton during his Navy years and after he married our mom, Rachel. Keeper Mollycheck served in the Lighthouse service for over 27 years. He retired on disability and moved back to the Mount Pleasant farm where he had been born with Lila and Ralph. He died on the farm in 1952. That would be his final heart attack. He was 49 years old. Lila died in Mount Pleasant when she was 89 and never remarried. Grandma said the happiest years of her life were spent in Southport. The Garrison family are all gone now. When you are able to get out and explore again, come visit the exhibit at Fort Johnston. If you are lucky, you will hear the Mollycheck family walking together again upstairs. Liz, do we have time for any questions?
I think we do. Does anybody, if you have any questions for Debbie, just unmute your mic and go ahead and ask them. Thank you, Debbie. That was wonderful.
You're welcome. Thank y'all for coming.
Does anybody have any questions for Debbie? I have one comment I wanted to make. Oh, Becky, did you have a question?
A question for Debbie about Lou Newton.
Yes.
Is that the attorney in Wilmington, Lou Newton?
Yes, yes, yeah. Lou died a few years ago and his son is still an attorney up there.
Right. I know his son, and then he has a second son too that I know. So when you said Lou Newton, I said I could be the same one.
Yes, it is.
Nice to hear those stories.
He was a great guy.
Yeah. Thank you for presenting this today. Very interesting. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
I wanted to make one comment, Debbie. I remembered when you were talking about Lila being the first woman to serve on jury duty.
Yes.
And I always enjoyed there was a newspaper article about that because it was such big news that a woman was serving on jury duty. And then what I liked is they interviewed the attorneys afterwards, and they said that they thought that women did a pretty good job on the jury, and matter of fact, maybe even better than men, because they thought that the women paid closer attention.
Yeah, they did.
So I thought that was funny. I thought it was pretty amazing that it was such news they had to write it up in the paper. So